Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Vince Stango, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Center. And it is my great pleasure to welcome historian and columnist Richard Brookhiser and Judge David Wecht. We have a wonderful program planned for you this evening, but before we begin, there are a few upcoming town hall programs that I'd like to tell you a little bit more about. First, coming up next week on October 22nd, we are hosting a special conversation on America's influence on the Norwegian Constitution. And this program is in conjunction with the special exhibition we are housing on the 200th anniversary of Norway's Constitution. What a unique program, and you'll only find it here. Then, to close out the month of October, on the 30th, we are thrilled to host two programs on the constitutional legacy of James Madison. And we'll be doing that with superb scholars like Bert Newborn and David Stewart, and federal judges including Diane Wood and Kent Jordan. Please visit our website, constitutioncenter.org, for a complete schedule of upcoming events, and we hope to see you back here real soon. We will be taking a few audience questions near the conclusion of the program, and if you wouldn't mind jotting down your questions on the note cards provided on your seat and handing your cards to staff members who are walking up and down the aisles. Video from today's program and all of our town hall programs is made available for view on our website at constitutioncenter.org/debate. Lastly, before we begin, please take a moment now to silence your cell phones. Give you a minute to do that. Thank you. Okay, now on to our show and our esteemed guests. Richard Brookhiser has been a columnist at the National Review since graduating from Yale in the late 1970s. He has extensively covered modern politics since then, and along the way, became a historian of the Founding Fathers. He curated Alexander Hamilton, the Man Who Made Modern America, an exhibition at the New York Historical Society. In 2008, he was awarded the National Medal of the Humanities. In 2011, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. He is the author of many books, including Gentleman Revolutionary, Gouverneur Morris, The Rake Who Wrote the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, American, and James Madison. It is a pleasure to welcome him back here tonight to discuss his new book, Founder's Son, A Life of Abraham Lincoln. Our moderator for tonight is Judge David Wecht. Judge Wecht has served on the Superior Court of Pennsylvania since January 2012. He served as a trial judge on the Court of Common Pleas for Pennsylvania's 5th Judicial District, from 2003 to 2012. And over nearly 9 years on the trial bench, he presided extensively in both civil and family divisions. From 2009 to 2011, Judge Wecht served by appointment of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania as administrative judge of the Family Division, which encompasses both domestic relations cases of juvenile dependency and delinquency. And it is an honor to host him here tonight. Now, if you'll please join me in welcoming our honored guests, Richard Brookhiser and Judge David Wecht.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope my lavalier microphone is neither too loud nor too soft, and I'm going to put some questions to our esteemed and honored guest. And I believe at some point you as well will have the opportunity to put some questions, no doubt much more articulate and much more learned than my own questions. The book is a wonderful book, and it's so special to have an opportunity to talk with you, Mr. Brookheiser, about your book. The first question that I would put to you, that I bet is on the minds of many of our visitors today, is why another book about Lincoln?
Well, there's a specific story, which is when I finished my last book on James Madison, I was giving a talk at Yale Law School to the Federalist Society, and the professor who hosted me there is an old friend of mine named Akil Amar. And Professor Amar took me out for coffee afterwards, and he said, "Rick, I know what your next book should be." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And he said, "You should write a book about Lincoln and the Founding Fathers and call it Founder's Son." And so I said, "Great," and I've done my assignment. But but the reason I jumped at that suggestion is I think any intelligent book on Lincoln looks at least somewhat at his thoughts on various founding fathers. But I would be one of the first founding fathers authors to look ahead to Lincoln. Those are all Lincoln scholars looking backwards. I would be a founders guy going ahead and sort of continuing the story.
Hence the title, of course, Founder's Son. And I wonder if you could take our audience back to the coming of age of a young man in that era, and what Lincoln would have seen and heard and thought. Were there founders still walking the earth, and how was a young person exposed to the thinking of the founders at that time?
Right. Lincoln is born in 1809, and he grows up in Kentucky for the first 7 years of his life, and then his family moves to Indiana, which is a brand new state, and then when he's 21, they move to Illinois, another fairly new state. So this is territory that almost no founding fathers ever went to. Many of them were still alive when he's a boy and a teenager, but by the 1830s, they are all dying off. In other words, when he is in his 20s, the last ones go. So the only way he is going to encounter them is in books. That's his only route. He never sees any of them. He doesn't live in a place where they live. And one of the first books in which he, I think, makes a connection with one of the founding fathers is Parson Weems' Life of George Washington. Now, this was one of the first biographies written about Washington. Weems was an Episcopal clergyman who was also a bookseller and book dealer. And he knew Washington very slightly. But he's a clever man, and he knows that a book on Washington would be a good seller. So Washington dies in 1799. A year later, Weems is out with his first edition of this book, and then he adds to it over the years. And Weems is a bad writer, but he's a great storyteller. I mean, his sentences are just not good, but his paragraphs and his stories are really terrific. And the proof is that we remember some of those today. I mean, the story of Washington and the cherry tree is something that everybody remembers. And, you know, the little boy is given a hatchet by his father, and then he swings it around and accidentally cuts the bark of a prized cherry tree, and then the father asks him who did this, you know, and young Washington says, "I can't tell a lie, I did it." And the father praises him for his honesty. But that was not what made an impression on young Abraham Lincoln. What impressed Lincoln was Weems's account of the Battle of Trenton, the crossing of the Delaware, and then the surprise attack on the Hessians the day after Christmas at the end of 1776, lowest point in the American Revolution, vital victory. And we know this impressed Lincoln because Lincoln said so himself. In 1861, when he's on his way to his first inauguration, he takes a train from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, and he stops in 6 states to make brief appearances. He's showing the flag as the country is falling apart. I mean, 6 Gulf states have already seceded. Texas will secede the day he arrives in Washington. And when he comes through Trenton, New Jersey, he addresses the New Jersey Legislature. It's the day before Washington's birthday. And he gives a little talk, and he recalls reading Weems's book when he was a boy. And he says what struck him. He said, "Boy though I was, it struck me that there must have been something more than common that those men fought for, more than just a struggle for independence. It must have been a struggle for something that was of importance to all men throughout the world. And this is exactly how Weems describes the Battle of Trenton. I mean, if you go back and read Parson Weems's book, he talks about the ice in the Delaware River and how hard it was to cross it and the cold and, you know, marching through this awful weather, and he's very dramatic about the battle and the Hessian foe and so on. But his main focus is that this is a struggle for liberty. And he introduces an allegorical figure, the Spirit of Liberty, who's hovering over Washington's troops as they cross the Delaware and they're marching onto Trenton to attack the Hessians. That liberty hovers over them. She's been driven out of Europe, says Weems. America is her last refuge, but her foes have followed with navies and armies. Who will defend her? Only this little band of men. You know, he's really trying to do the best he can to show that this is a struggle for liberty in the world. And that made an impression on Lincoln. And he says in 1861, he says, you know how these impressions in boyhood are some of the strongest that we have. So I think that was the first thing that got this young man's attention.
And there he is out there on what was still essentially the frontier,
Yes.
or close to it. And reading Weems, the stories we have are sometimes by candlelight, I take it. I suppose it's somewhat difficult for us in this day and age with laptops and desktops and iPhones and everything that we have to appreciate what it must have been like for a person in that time to do research, to learn, to expose himself or herself to information. How did Lincoln go about accessing information and educating himself at that time?
Well, he's probably the least educated president we've ever had. Maybe Andrew Johnson, but if you add up all the schooling he had in his life, it's 1 year. He went to 5 one-room schoolhouses, different ones, 2 in Kentucky, 3 in Indiana, and the total time is 1 year. And he learned to read and write, and he learned mathematics up to the level of cross multiplication. And then everything else was self-education. When he was in his early 40s, he reads Euclid. You know, he goes through the first 6 books of Euclid. And he was so proud of that, he mentioned that in a campaign autobiography in 1860. You know, so that he was patting himself on the back for that. In those days, there were no law schools, but what most young men who wanted to be lawyers did was it was like an apprenticeship in the office of an established lawyer. It was called reading the law. And you had a job in a law office, and you would be shown through the rudiments of it. Lincoln didn't do that. He did have an older friend who was a lawyer. He would visit him occasionally to borrow books and ask questions, but he did it by reading himself. Now, you could do that in those days, but that was the hard way to go about it. I mean, something like Blackstone, you know, which is just a dense, dense book. And there's a story of Lincoln sitting on a woodpile in his 20s, and he's got his nose in a book, and someone in the town in Illinois says, you know, what are you reading? And he says, I'm reading the law. And the guy says, great God Almighty. You know, it was like, what is he doing? But this was his attitude to books, to learning. He loved Shakespeare. He never read all of Shakespeare's plays. He only read certain ones. But what Lincoln did read, he read deeply. I mean, he just focused on it. He bore down on it. So, and there were books that circulated in rural America. I mean, Weems was not the only itinerant bookseller. There were some people in the little towns in Illinois where he first moved who had had college educations. There were people who knew their Shakespeare, knew their Robert Burns. Everybody knew the Bible, King James Version, which, of course, among other things, is a great work of literature. So, you know, this is a man who we now realize clearly had a literary gift and an intellectual gift, but he also had a powerful desire to use them. So whatever he could get, he just grabbed onto it.
Speaking of those gifts that he had, in your book you have some fascinating information about his background and his family tree, and I wonder if you could share a few snippets of that.
Well, I think the Founding Fathers were his surrogate fathers. We never get everything we want or need from our families. I mean, if we're lucky, we get a lot. If we're less lucky, we get less. Lincoln's relationship with his own father was troubled. There was a period in the mid-20th century where people really wrote harshly of Thomas Lincoln. I think biographers have backed off from that. He was a responsible man. He was a farmer and a carpenter. He never went broke. He never left bad debts. He was on several juries, which was a sign that the community, thought well of him. But he and his son just never got along. They were just different kinds of people. And he sent him to school. He wanted him to know how to read and write, which he could barely do himself. But he couldn't understand reading. He couldn't understand why would you be fascinated with a book. Lincoln's stepmother did. Lincoln's mother died when he was 9. His father remarried when he was almost 11. And his stepmother, who was Sarah Bush, became Sarah Bush Lincoln, really seems to have got her stepson. I mean, America is very lucky that this woman came along. But she knew that this stepson of hers was a bright boy, a bright child, and she encouraged him, and she did encourage him as much as she could. So Lincoln, and one of the poignant things, Lincoln rarely talked about his childhood or his family, his parents. But there was a moment in 1850-51, he's riding along with his law partner at the time, a man named William Herndon, who would become Lincoln's biographer. And we owe a lot of what we know about Lincoln to the interviews that Herndon did after Lincoln was killed. Herndon realized, now I've got to write a book about this man. And he looked up old friends, he interviewed the stepmother. I mean, he really did a lot of oral history. So Lincoln's riding along, 1850, with Herndon, and he's sort of out of the blue, he says, my mother was illegitimate. And her father was not, not the one that everybody thinks. He was a noble Virginian. Both his parents had come to Kentucky from Virginia. And then he goes on, he says, I think it's from this noble Virginian that I get all my special qualities. And he's explaining, that illegitimacy probably makes kids better because it's, I guess we'd call it hybrid vigor, it's not the normal course of things, so they're stronger. He's like spinning this theory, and Herndon is just fascinated. And then Lincoln stops, and then an old farmer rides up and starts chatting, and then Lincoln tells a few stories, and that's it. He never went there again. And I think this is a fantasy.
A fantasy of Herndon? Or
No, a fantasy of Lincoln. I mean, Herndon is very honest. He would not make up something like that. But Lincoln, no one else ever mentioned this. And I think it's just Lincoln trying to explain to himself, why am I so odd? Why am I unlike everyone I grew up with the partial exception of his stepmother? And so we think, well, I must be, and this is fairy tales. There's the child who's really the prince, the secret prince, that kind of thing. So I think that was sort of Lincoln's little thought.
Although one noble Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, was certainly quite tall, like maybe not as tall as Lincoln.
Yeah. Well, yes, and the American political world knew or gossiped about Jefferson's black children. I mean, this was not a story that we discovered. This was out there all during Lincoln's lifetime. This was known in the early 19th century. And Jefferson becomes very important to Lincoln in the climax of his life, from the 1850s right up till the Civil War and his death. But there's another founder before he gets to Jefferson who has a very interesting kind of quirky effect on him, and that's Thomas Paine. And Lincoln read Paine when he moved to Illinois, and he read Paine's patriotic writing, Common Sense, but he also read The Age of Reason, which is Paine's ferocious attack on Christianity and all organized religion. Paine was not an atheist, but he was I guess we would say a deist. He believed in God. As he said, I believe in one God and no more. But he thought that all religions were just organized to terrify and oppress people. And The Age of Reason, most of it is going through the Bible and quibbling and quarreling with this inconsistency and that contradiction. And, it's really like with a fine-tooth comb. And it's kind of a perfect book, or the opposite of a perfect book, for a country which is very Bible literate. America, Bible-reading, Protestant country, and Paine is just standing it on its head and saying, no, this is all wrong. And so Lincoln, when he's in his 20s, he reads Paine. His parents were religious. They were Baptists. His father was a church trustee at one point. So I think part of this is rebellion. But he reads Paine and he thinks, this is great. It's all nonsense. I don't have to worry about any of this anymore. It's all contradictions. Jesus was illegitimate, on and on and on. And he when he's in his early 20s, and he's a postmaster. That was one of his jobs. He had a number of jobs, different jobs in his early 20s. And in that town, there was no post office. The postmaster worked in someone's store, just had a little corner of the store. And that's where he, took in the letters and handed them out to the people they were going to. But so Lincoln is there with all the fellows and saying one night, well, I have written a pamphlet, an attack on Christianity, and I want to get it printed. And then an older man, the owner of the store, a man named Samuel Hill, he said, oh, let me see that. He took the pamphlet and he stuck it in the stove, burned it up. Because Lincoln was already interested in politics. No, you're not going to print this thing, because that would be the end of you. I mean, it was the end of Paine. He went from being this great hero of the Revolution, and then he writes The Age of Reason, and suddenly he's this goat and this devil figure in America. And so this kid in Illinois, he's just going to destroy himself if he prints something like that. So that was the end of Lincoln publicizing these thoughts. Then he learns to become prudent about them. And then at some point, and we can't say when, because he does not talk about this a lot, his ideas begin to change. And you see it most dramatically in the Civil War.
And in particular, of course, and everyone here who's been to the Lincoln Memorial, of course, has had the opportunity to read the Second Inaugural, and that is full of biblical allusion. Did Lincoln's value system change, or did he make a deliberate choice to invoke the divine in ways that he did not do earlier in his career?
Well, he uses biblical language really throughout the 1850s. His mature career starts in 1854, which is when the Missouri Compromise is repealed by the Nebraska bill. And this is Stephen Douglas's idea for how to settle the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This was like the last chunk of the Louisiana Purchase that was not yet organized into territories. It's the modern state of Kansas, and then Nebraska was everything from Nebraska up to Canada. So basically the Missouri River to the Rockies. and it was beginning to be settled. So how do we organize this into territories? And Douglas proposed, even though the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the Louisiana Territory and said, north of this line, there will be no slavery. But so Douglas comes along now in 1854 and says, well, let's have two territories here, and the residents can decide whether they want slavery or not. And he says, this is an ancient, well, this is an American principle. It's self-government. You know, you let the people decide. And this is how America has always been run. This is how the colonies were run before independence. I'm just fulfilling this principle. And Lincoln and much of the North is outraged by this, because there had always been compromises between slave states and free states, trade-offs. But this seemed to be taking back something that had been reserved for freedom and saying, well, maybe it could be a slave state. So it's 1854. Lincoln says he's aroused by this as he's never been before. He gets back into politics. He'd been in the Illinois legislature for 8 years, served one term in Congress, did not run for re-election. And he's kind of at loose ends. He's a lawyer, successful lawyer, but this brings him charging back into politics. And beginning here, he's starting to use biblical imagery. His great speech that kicks off the rest of his life is in Peoria in October 1854. It's called the Peoria Speech. It's a 3-hour-long speech, longest he ever gave. And there he lays down the themes really for the next 6 years of his life and even through the Civil War. And he basically says, our principles are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, in the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade slavery in the Old Northwest, and in the Constitution, which, although it guarantees slavery in certain ways, allows the slave trade to be ended in 1808, which it was, and never mentions slavery. Slavery is never mentioned in the Constitution. It's always persons held to labor. And Lincoln knew from reading Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention that was deliberate. And Madison said in the deliberations, you know, it would be wrong to admit property in men in wording. I mean, even though they were going to protect it in the provisions of it, but they didn't want to say what they were doing. And Lincoln thought that was important. So this is what he says in the speech, but he uses biblical imagery. He says, our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit of the Revolution. And that's, you know, the saved in the book of Revelation have white robes. You know, they're described as having white robes. And in the book of Daniel, the Ancient of Days, who is God, wears a white robe. So Lincoln is using this biblical imagery. And whether that's an indication of faith or an indication of the literary power of the King James Bible, it's certainly the second. Is it the first? Not sure. I think what then begins to happen to him as the Civil War begins and then lasts and lasts and lasts is he is confronted with a horrible situation, which is, here is this unprecedented level of carnage and slaughter. 1. 2, God controls the world. God rules the world. 3, therefore, God wills this. God controls everything, therefore he must be willing this. Why? You know, and Lincoln, you know, he beats his mind against this problem for years. Herndon, his law partner, said that he was always a determinist. And Lincoln had a little phrase. He said, the motive was born before the man. In other words, any action you take, the motive for that action was born before you were born. Everything is a chain of causes and effects. You know, you just follow it back. Everything is determined. And this was, this was an aspect of the logic of Lincoln's mind. Philosophers have tussled with this for millennia and their alternative ways of looking at things, but this was the way Lincoln thought, Lincoln saw it. And so now as he becomes more religious, more of a theist, but here's this problem. These battles, these horrible battles are happening. God could stop them. He writes a memo to himself in, I think it's 1862, private memo. And he said, God could prevent this, could have prevented this war. He could stop it at any moment by his quiet power on the minds of the contestants. Yet he does not. Therefore, he wills that it continue. So he just, he wrestles with this problem. And I track some of the ways we can follow it, because from time to time he will have a discussion with someone, or he'll write a letter about it. I mean, not often, because he keeps these things buttoned up to himself, but you can see here and there little signs of it.
In what ways did Lincoln invoke the founders in his arguments concerning slavery, and how, if at all, did he square the founders' own ownership of slaves with their views?
Well, this is, this is something that gets thrown at him repeatedly, and most often by his great rival in Illinois politics, who's Stephen Douglas. And these men, they knew each other as young men. They were not unfriendly. I mean, Illinois politics was a small world, and then the state grew, but they knew each other from way back. They were both lawyers, always in different parties. But they start going head-to-head beginning in 1854. Lincoln tries to be elected as a senator by the Illinois Legislature in 1855. That doesn't work. Then he runs against Douglas in 1858. Douglas narrowly wins. And then finally they run against each other for president in 1860. So, and Douglas is a star of the Democratic Party. I mean, he has a meteoric career. He gets in the Senate very young. He's at Henry Clay's right hand, helping him do the Compromise of 1850, which is Clay's last great compromise. And then Douglas kicks his own compromise over in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska bill. So Lincoln and Douglas are these two men going back and forth. And Douglas has his own vision of the Founding Fathers. And he says the Founding Fathers made this country half slave and half free. And look at its success. Look how we've grown. Look how we've prospered. We can keep it that way forever. Why not do it and just have the states not bother the other states about their internal arrangements? And so Lincoln has to make a somewhat subtle counter-argument. He says the founders did not make this country half slave and half free. They found it that way. Slavery was already existing. When all the Founding Fathers were born, slavery was up and running in this country. They did not know how to get rid of it. How would you do it? They didn't know. But what they did do, says Lincoln, is they put it in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, how did they do that? They prevented it from expanding to the Northwest Territory, which they did in 1787. And this was when the Constitution was being written. It's the old Congress, the one-house Continental Congress, that passes the Northwest Ordinance in the summer of 1787. And some of the men who were our delegates to the Constitutional Convention are also congressmen. So they're both debating the Constitution in Philadelphia, and they're voting on the Northwest Ordinance in New York in the same summer. They also say in the Constitution that the slave trade can be forbidden beginning in 1808, and that is done. So Lincoln says they cut off its expansion in one direction, they forbade its expansion in one direction, and they cut off its supply in the other. And they hoped that it would wither away. Well, it didn't. It continued to grow. But Lincoln says this was their hope, and look at the language of the Declaration of Independence. which everybody signed off on, all 13 states, even though all 13 states had slavery in 1776. All of them did. But they all signed the Declaration of Independence. Now then Douglas says, well, that was only for white men. Douglas says this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. He says this was for men of the white race of European descent. It did not apply to Negroes or to inferior and degraded races such as Indians or Fijis or Malays. That's what Douglas says. And then Lincoln says, no, men is men. I mean, that's what it means. And he, and then Douglas will come back, well, then you must be saying Negroes and white people are equal. And probably what you really want is race mixing. I mean, this was a Democratic charge throughout the 1850s and 60s. And in fact, the word miscegenation was invented by Democratic journalists for the 1864 election, because that's what Republicans wanted. And Lincoln's response is, I am not saying that a black woman is my equal in all respects, but in her right to eat the bread that she makes with her own hands, she is the equal of me and of any man. And he says that over and over again.
I think he had the comment about not marrying a black woman, right?
Oh yeah, well this is one of his jokes. I mean, he will say, I don't understand why, because I don't want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily have her for a wife. I can just let her alone. Now, he said this half a dozen times, 10 times, 12 times. Always got a laugh. But it's a laugh, I think he was raising a laugh that would make people think. You'll laugh at the joke, but let her alone also means let her be free. And of course, then what's behind the joke is everybody's knowledge that under slavery, women are raped all the time, or turned into mistresses or concubines. And Lincoln does allude to this. He says in one of his speeches, I think it's the Peoria Speech, he points out how many mulattoes there are in the South. And he says, well, how did that happen? And that's an effect of slavery. So he's sort of playing on people's sexual anxieties and, in fact, on his own anxieties. His love life was never a happy one. Let's put it that way. But Douglas is always after him with a riposte, and Lincoln always has a counter argument, and it's like a boxing match, and they're just going back and forth and back and forth. And I believe the reason Lincoln, after several defeats, finally does beat Douglas is that I think he had a superior understanding of what the founders did believe. I think he was more right about them than anyone else.
And I suppose it's easy for us to forget just how mainstream Douglas's views were at the time. After all, Chief Justice Taney wrote the Dred Scott decision in that same period of time, right? About the black man having no rights that the white man was bound to respect.
That's right. Yeah, and Taney's argument was, well, at the time the Constitution was written, that's what the founders thought, so therefore this court must take that view. This is his version of originalism. Now, one of his colleagues on the bench, one of the dissenting opinions, points out that in 4 states at the time the Constitution was ratified, free blacks had the right to vote. I think it was New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, and New Hampshire or Massachusetts. So not only did free black men have the right to vote, that presumably some of them voted on the Constitution, to ratify it or not to ratify it. So Taney was historically wrong in making that assertion.
Were there myths about Lincoln that were shattered for you in the process of your work on this book, or presumptions that may have been undermined?
The only thing I think that changed was I had not realized how depressed he was. I knew he was melancholy, and you just have to look at the pictures. You can see that. But he was an unhappy man. He was a depressed man. There were 2 periods in his life when he was suicidal. I mean, friends said, I had to hide the razors.
Maybe that's why he grew a beard. The razor was on.
Yes, that's right. You hid my razors. Well, the beard is interesting. He got that letter from the 11-year-old girl, when he's running for president. Oh, Mr. Lincoln, you should grow a beard. And then he did grow a beard. I think part of that was hiding. If you grow a beard, of course, it's an illusion. It's childish, but you're hiding. You're hiding your face. And he knows he might become president in 1860. It's not an easy time to go into the White House. But so I was surprised by the degree of his depression. And I think work was his cure. And I think humor was his cure. I mean, he was a very funny man. He had 1 million stories. He was very good at telling stories. I include 2 of them in the book, which are slightly off color. He had a lot of off color.
You can't tell the outhouse one here, but the readers can.
The outhouse one, if you saw the Spielberg movie, Daniel Day-Lewis tells the outhouse story during the Spielberg movie, and it's not. I mean, he repeated stories, obviously, so he may well have told that story where Spielberg shows it in being told in late 1864, early 1865. We do know, now this is a story about Ethan Allen supposedly goes to England after the Revolutionary War, and to needle him, the Brits hang a picture of George Washington in an outhouse, and then they say, oh, did you see the picture of your friend? And finally Allen says, well, I think that's a very good place for you to hang it. And they say, oh, why is that? Because nothing will make an Englishman shit so quick as a picture of George Washington. So Lincoln told this joke 1 million times. But one time he told it, and I think this is very interesting, was in 1860 when he's in Springfield and the Republican convention that will or will not nominate him for president is meeting in Chicago. And he's waiting in Springfield all day to hear the results by telegraph. And he played handball with some friends. And one of the friends wrote that he told this Ethan Allen joke. And I think, well, if he gets the nomination, he'll sit where Washington sat. And, you just, with the country and the state it's in, what would you feel like? I don't believe there are accidents in joke telling. So,
well, we have some fine questions from our audience. One is, could the deaths of Lincoln's sons have also had an impact on his move toward a more religious approach to life?
Oh, sure. He lost one boy in the early 1850s, and then he lost another while he was president. Now, there was a lot of death in the 19th century. Well, we're all going to die, right? And that's always been true. But there was just a lot of mortality from diseases. One of Lincoln's secretaries, Secretary of the Treasury, Samuel Chase, he lost 3 wives. He had 3 of his wives died. I mean, it's horrifying, but that was not so uncommon. But of course, common things take different people different ways. And I'm not saying that any parent would, blow off the death of a child, but I think particularly for a man prone to depression as Lincoln was, with a marriage that had its problems, partly because his wife was also prone to depression. I think she also had ups and downs. Lincoln didn't have ups, he just had downs. Lincoln was hard to be married to. When she became demanding, he'd just tune her out. He'd read the paper, he'd take a walk, he'd play with the children. And yet they both loved literature, they both loved poetry, they both loved politics. So I think there were some, reasons why they did get married and stayed together. Not that divorce was an option then. But yes, of course, the deaths of his sons hit him, and he thought he had dreams about the second one who died when he was president. His wife tried to contact her dead son with spiritualists. Lincoln was superstitious, but not in that way. He didn't. Spiritualism was kind of a modern thing, and almost like scientific. It was like Mesmer, and maybe there's a scientific basis for this. And Lincoln was never interested in that, but he did believe in a lot of superstitions, like mad stones, which are like deer hairballs, and they could cure poisoning and stuff like that.
There was a prior love in Lincoln's life, wasn't there?
Yes. He fell in love with a young woman named Anne Rutledge, and then she got sick and died. And what particularly seemed to oppress Lincoln was the thought of rain on her grave. And this was one of the rainiest years that Illinois ever had. It rained for 4.5 solid months. And Lincoln was just tormented by the thought of rain on her grave. And that's like another sign of depression. Because, it just rains. I mean, it rains everywhere. It rains on graves, it rains on houses, it rains on us. But if you're depressed, I mean, you feel it raining on you and yours.
All right, here's a fun one. Abraham Lincoln is the current president of the United States. In the current conditions, what is his first step as leader on the Syria-Iraq-ISIS situation? What would he do concerning the pending Ebola crisis in our country and in our world? And I have other questions, but I think that's enough. That's.
Well, on ISIS in Syria, he'd talk it over with Seward, his Secretary of State, and try to come up with a policy. Foreign policy is not. I mean, it wasn't absent during his presidency. The important thing was to keep Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. They did recognize them as a belligerent, but they did not recognize them as a nation, with which they exchanged ambassadors. If they'd done that, we would have had to go to war with them. And there were some very brinky moments, but and Seward, the complicating thing here was Seward, the Secretary of State, was very much an American expansionist. I mean, he would buy Alaska, he bought Midway, he was always looking, he wanted to buy St. Bart's, he was always looking for islands and things to buy, and he was a bit of an Anglophobe. And so at one of these tense moments, he sent this blistering message to Britain, and Lincoln toned it down. And then the ambassador in London, Charles Francis Adams, he toned it down again when he delivered it. And we were helped a lot by Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, who was dying at the time. But the two of them really sat on Palmerston, who was their prime minister, and the crisis passed.
Did Lincoln inherit any aspects of his humor from the founders?
Paine is a very funny man. Paine is very good at using humor to make his serious points. And Paine is very serious about his attack on Christianity. He really wants to do the maximum damage he can, but he uses humor in doing it. And I think it's in a way that Lincoln would also use, which is to try and take an argument and make it ridiculous by just taking it to its full logical extent. Paine talks about the virgin birth. He says, if any girl now said that she were made pregnant by a ghost and that an angel told her so, would she be believed? Paine had his own sexual anxieties, which maybe is why Lincoln liked him. But I think Lincoln Lincoln didn't need to be told how to be funny. He was that naturally. But Paine is an example of how you use humor to make a serious case, and Lincoln was brilliant at doing that. I think that it's also one thing he got from his father that he never acknowledged. His father was a great storyteller, and we know that from two cousins of Lincoln's, John Hanks and Dennis Hanks, who knew both the father and the son, and they both said the father was a wonderful storyteller. And I think Lincoln had to have picked that up.
And Lincoln's father had been exposed to a very severe trauma in his own childhood.
Yes. Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln's father, who was Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, was also Abraham Lincoln. And he was in his field in Kentucky one day, and he was shot and killed by an Indian who moved to seize Thomas, who was a boy of like 6 or 7. And one of his brothers went back and got a gun and shot the Indian. And our Abraham Lincoln said, you know, he heard this over and over again. As a kid, it was like a legend in his family.
Lincoln refers back more to the Declaration of Independence than the Constitution, as he does in the Gettysburg Address. Why do you think this is so?
Well, in the Gettysburg Address, he does both. He begins with the Declaration, but the ending of it is the preamble. You know, of the people, by the people, for the people. That goes back to we the people. And Lincoln always says, I uphold both. And so he's distinguishing himself from people like Douglas, who he would say are distorting the Declaration because they're changing the meaning of all men being created equal. And he's distinguishing himself from abolitionists who hated the Constitution. William Lloyd Garrison burned it. He said it was a deal with the devil and with hell. And he burned it in Boston in 1840-something. It was a famous provocation of his. And, you know, the abolitionist argument was, well, you know, it guarantees the return of fugitive slaves. It includes slaves in the apportionment of the House of Representatives. You know, it's a deeply, deeply flawed document. And Lincoln always said, no, I uphold both. And that's how that was sort of the path that he steered.
Several authors reported an episode possibly taking place in the fall of 1864 when someone took a shot at Lincoln, striking his hat. Did you come across such an incident? And if so, do you really think such an incident happened?
Oh, yeah. Someone took a shot at him when he was riding back from the soldiers' home, which is in the district. It was kind of the Camp David of its time. It was the place he'd go to relax a little bit. It was it's still there. You can still go see it, but it's elevated. The air is better. It's healthier. And he would go back and forth, and this would drive Stanton, his Secretary of War, nuts. I mean, he would say, no, you've got it. You can't do this. You have to be protected. And Lincoln was fatalistic. You know, he said, look, if someone is going to kill me, it's going to happen, and, you know, you can't prevent that kind of thing. And I don't know about the hat. I don't know about it hitting his hat, but someone did take a shot at him. So, you know, and the thing was, 2 presidents had died already. Harrison had died in 1841, and Taylor had died in 1850 of natural causes. But so there had already been 2 vice presidents who'd been elevated to the presidency. So this was a possibility. And someone had shot at Andrew Jackson. There'd been a madman who'd accosted him. I think it was a funeral. Jackson was in the Capitol, coming down the steps, and a man fired 2 pistols at him, and they both misfired. And he thought that he should be king of England, and Jackson was preventing this somehow, so he wanted to. And
Jackson went after him with a cane, right?
Yes, I think you didn't want to pick a quarrel with Old Hickory. Yeah, this man was subdued, and then Jackson said, "Oh, there's this senator I'm quarreling with. He put this guy up to it," which was just not true at all. But so I think Lincoln's fatalism made him more casual about this than he ought to have been, and that's not just reading back from the disaster that did occur.
There's another story told from that same period in 64, very close to the soldiers' home, and I wonder, like the questioner, I'll ask if you came across this one and if you think it happened, that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who went on to become one of the greatest justices, was a young soldier at Fort Stevens,
right,
also in Northern District of Columbia, and he was at the parapet and with his rifle poking out at Jubal Early's army, and he saw a tall figure pass behind him with a top hat, and he said, "Get down, you damn fool." And then he looked down the line and realized he had just said that to the President of the United States. Did that happen?
Well, the source is Holmes, and I don't think the story got worse over the years. Could have happened. Could have happened.
Okay, here's another one going to an entirely different area. What would Lincoln think of Obamacare?
Well, Lincoln was a very precedent-following man and president. He is president during a civil war. He accomplishes the greatest liberation in American history, except possibly the Revolution. He ends up with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. 4 million people are freed. Nothing like this before or after. But he's very mindful of legalities. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation is narrowly and carefully drawn. It is by his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of rebellion. And it only frees the slaves of rebels because he had no power, he believed, as president, to free any other slaves. He could only free those slaves because they were the slaves of rebels in a time of rebellion. He asks the slave states which are loyal, there are 4 of them, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. He asks them during the war, would you consider a program of compensated emancipation? And he asks politicians from these states. He talks about this. He talks about this to Congress. Nobody bites. But then finally, at the end of his second term, Congress considers the 13th Amendment, and then Lincoln does a lobby to get that successfully passed by the House in January of 1865, and that will end slavery nationwide, but that's by the constitutional amendment process. But even there, Lincoln says that the former slave states, the seceded states, which he thought secession had no legal reality. But he said those states should be included in the tally of, how many states getting 2/3 of them, or getting the right percentage of them. We should include the former Confederate states, because otherwise this will be challenged. And in fact, eight of the former Confederate states did ratify the 13th Amendment. And that was what Lincoln wanted to it happened after he was killed. But that's what he wanted to have happen, and that's what did happen. So he's always very mindful of legalities and precedents. So Obamacare, he would put it through a constitutional, finest of fine combs. Lincoln was also very big on people working. Now, this comes from his being a Whig. This is before the Republican Party gets founded. But he belonged to this party that existed for only 20 years, the Whigs. And one thing about Whigs is they believed in self-made men. And that was a phrase that Henry Clay used. He didn't invent it, but he used it, and he gave a kind of a memorable speech about it. And Lincoln admired Clay's economic program. So he would have to square Obamacare, if he could, with that. So I'm not giving you an answer because these things are tough to do, but I'm telling you how Lincoln would approach this question.
Can you discuss the First Amendment's freedom of religion clause, its impact on Lincoln and Lincoln's religion or lack thereof?
Well, I've been doing that, I think. I would say if to be a Christian means to accept Christ as your Savior, I'm not sure you can call Lincoln a Christian. He is certainly, by the end of his life and by the Second Inaugural, he believes in the God of the Bible. And he says, his solution to this great problem he's been agonizing over is that God is punishing North and South for the sin of slavery. And that's God does this to Israel at various times and for various reasons. And in Lincoln's mind, God is now doing this to the United States. there is a moment at the end, late in his life. His best friend, maybe the only friend he ever had, was a man named Joshua Speed. And they bonded because they were very similar. They were very literary. They were very depressed. Their relationships with women were unhappy. I mean, Speed is the source of the notion that Lincoln was gay, which I don't believe he was.
In fact, you've written an article on that subject.
I reviewed, there was a book by a man named Tripp that came out a few years ago. I reviewed it in the Times. I think I'd review it more skeptically than I did. I would call Lincoln LGBTU, U for unhappy. That's what he was. And Speed was the same, and they were sort of very similar in that way. And Speed visited him a couple of times when he was president. And Speed said that on one of those occasions, Lincoln was reading a Bible, and Speed said to him, well, I still can't believe that book, referring to past discussions of 20 years ago. And Lincoln said, no, Speed, you're wrong. This is the best book. You should really read that. Now, then what does that mean? Does that mean he's accepting the accounts or the statements of Jesus about his own role and Paul's statements about who Jesus was? What is it that he's talking about? We'll never know.
I have two more here
Okay.
from our audience. In 2008, it was widely publicized that Barack Obama was a big fan of Abe Lincoln. I assume he still is. Please describe actions as well as behaviors which are aligned with the 16th president, as well as those that are contrary to him.
Well, they're both black. No, Lincoln
It's
was...
your comment about what Clinton said, what they said about Clinton. Right?
Well, right. Toni Morrison said Clinton was the first black president, but actually Lincoln was. He was called a black Republican. All Republicans were called that by their enemies. And there are cartoons of Lincoln with a blackened face because, he's in favor of Negroes, so we'll call him black. So that was something that was thrown at him. He was also called white trash by radical Republicans who thought he wasn't moving fast enough. So he sort of got it from both sides. I think the biggest difference between them is that our current president is humorless. And humor was very important to Lincoln. It was partly a technique. It was a distraction. If people came to see him and he wanted to get rid of them, he'd tell them a funny story, and they'd laugh, and then they'd realize, wait a second, he didn't talk about what I wanted to talk about. But it was also, it relieved this depression of his, and it's also a way of seeing himself in the world. If you have a sense of humor, you realize it's not all about me. I'm not the perfect person. I'm not going to get everything I want. All these people who are causing trouble for me. Well, all right, that's their problem. They have their own problems. It's just a way of putting things in perspective, and I think that strange combination of his sadness and his humor was very important to him, and I think is a key part of his effect on his time and since.
The last audience question I've been given asks about a quote from Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals.
Mm-hmm.
The quote that I'm given here is, according to our questioner, from page 93 of the book. I've read the book, but I remember the topic. So the quote is, quote, "Before his marriage, Lincoln enjoyed close relations with young women and almost certainly found outlets for his sexual urges among the prostitutes who were readily available on the frontier," close quote. This, according to our questioner, this statement seems purely speculative and bordering on libel. Have you come across anything that would support Ms. Goodwin's statement?
Well, the two sources for that, there's a kind of a joke that Speed told. which is clearly a joke. It's a joke about Lincoln and a prostitute, and Lincoln makes an arrangement with her, and then he finds out what the fee is, and he doesn't have enough money, so as he's putting his clothes back on, and then he gives her a full refund, and the prostitute says, "Oh, Mr. Lincoln, you're the most honest man." I mean, it's a joke about Honest Abe involving a prostitute, and, well, it's a story, but clearly it's a joke. I mean, it's in the form of a joke, so how literally true was that meant, who knows. Herndon did say that Lincoln had used prostitutes in a town called Beardstown, which was a river town in Illinois. I don't think this contradicts at all my sense of his uneasiness around women. I mean, if you're uneasy around women, prostitution, one thing it does is you pay them to go away. That's what you're really paying them to do. You're not paying them to be there, you're paying them to leave. And it's one of the things that we want to know, and we never will fully.
Thank you very much. The book signing is downstairs, I believe, and I wanted to remind you on behalf of the National Constitution Center that our speaker, Mr. Brookheiser, will be signing books downstairs, and I want to thank Mr. Brookheiser for his wonderful visit.
Thank you. That was fun.